Hey, New York. Today's media landscape is a vast cacophony of shows and movies competing for your attention. With so many streaming services to choose from, it's hard to know where one ends and the other begins. From sitcoms to dramas to reality TV, it seems like we've already seen it all. But in 2020, a new show started on HBO from a previously unknown creator who seems to present the world we inhabit in a unique and refreshing way. A show that holds a mirror up to modern life like nothing else on TV right now. So if you're looking to give your writing a unique new style, there's a lot we can learn from this guy. Stick with me and I'll teach you how to write exactly like How To with John Wilson. How To with John Wilson, produced by Nathan Fielder, is a documentary comedy series which chronicles the daily life of filmmaker John Wilson as he searches for answers to life's most pressing questions. Whether it's learning how to make small talk or figuring out how to split the check at dinner. While traveling from Manhattan to places like Cancun or New Orleans, he discovers interesting people from all walks of life, each with their distinctive perspective, and often with generally comedic results. Unlike other docu-comedies like Borat or Nathan For You, here Wilson doesn't usually appear in front of the camera, nor does he assume a larger-than-life prankster persona to get a reaction out of his subjects. Instead, Wilson lurks in the background, infusing his own brand of awkward comedy through his unpolished narration, his editing techniques, and a vast collection of serendipitous shots of the mundane weirdness in everyday life.
Did you invent this?
Yes.
Why did you invent this?
Because I had a window cleaner fall off a building and die.
Oh.
What normally is left on the cutting room floor on a different show is now the main course for How To. This unglamorous roughness invites us to get a good look at something we'd otherwise turn away from in real life. Yet at the end of it all, this proverbial dirty laundry that Wilson airs out on his show doesn't devolve into a mean-spirited freak show. It's more relatable, if not weirdly comforting, and sometimes a poignant tug at your heart gets past your defenses with the Trojan horse of comedy at the forefront. But how does he do it? How does what seems like a combination of the popular video essay and r/hmmm get us to feel such complex emotions? Well, just like with anything on Storyograph, we gotta turn to good old story structure and find out the themes. At the top of each episode, John Wilson introduces a how-to topic, a common issue that many of us struggle with in our daily lives. Often a sort of observational humor, such as pointing out the overuse of scaffolding in New York, or how cats tend to ruin our furniture with their incessant scratching. He then asks how we might remedy the situation. He delivers this part mostly in second-person narration, referring to the viewer directly as one might expect from a normal how-to video.
A nice way to begin is by leaving your apartment and trying to find someone who is willing to talk to you. Thankfully, New York is filled with friendly people, so this should be easy.
Sometimes he even gives us a little history on the subject, and invariably he asks the people he meets their opinion on the topic. By the end of this first section, some kind of conclusion is usually drawn, or rather at this point, an assumption, since this is the first of a few conclusions and is generally the least informed one. Though all episodes of the show follow a very similar set of story beats, for examples, I'll be using the pilot episode, How to Make Small Talk. In this first episode, John's first conclusion is that opening up too much to people would make him come off as weird and drive people away.
An expert small talker will know how to suppress these emotions and appear stable, no matter how much pressure is building up inside.
But these initial assumptions are usually very superficial and spark the need to dig deeper. In the second part, John will switch from mainly second-person narration to mainly first-person narration, as he starts to make this how-to question more personal. Here he tends to infuse himself into the narrative if he hasn't already, giving us more emotional buy-in to this concept. And by inserting himself into the story, Wilson in a way denies himself the safety of being an unseen, unquestionable narrator. Here we're invited to gawk at all his relatable foibles and insecurities alongside the strangers we meet along the way.
If you need to retrieve a sweater from someone that you used to date, start first by sending them a text message. If you discover that they had deleted your number, just calmly remind them of your name.
In How to Make Small Talk, we see that John has a hard time opening up to people, and it causes a strain on his relationships. In this example, we can see his personal stakes in learning a deeper way to connect with people. During this second part, we also see John start to lay the groundwork for the next section. We see him begin to ramp up to the big set piece that will be the main event of the episode. In the pilot, this means booking a trip to Cancun with a travel agent, so he has something to talk about when making small talk. The conclusion that John draws at the end of this second section is the flawed view that is often furthest from the episode's true conclusion. At this point in the pilot, John worries that relationships with people only lead to messy complications and inevitable heartbreak, so he uses his vacation as an excuse to get away from everyone. However, the third section of this show is the response to this incomplete conclusion. As alluded to before, in every episode the big travel set piece is what sticks out in our mind, and it comes about halfway through the narrative, maybe a bit later. Here, John will often leave New York in search for real answers to his elusive questions. He tests his previous conceptions against the experts in their field. Often in this section, if John gets the answer he was looking for, it almost has sort of a monkey's paw vibe to it. Like when his attempt to avoid people accidentally lands him in the middle of MTV's Spring Break. Things are so casual yet so intimate that everything he's learned about small talk is rendered useless. During this grand shakeup, disillusionment hits John hard as his previous conclusions are shattered. He's sometimes forced to make on-the-fly addendums to his philosophy while trying to make sense of everything he's experiencing, like weaponizing small talk to make friends with passersby.
Where are you going?
Back to our room, bro.
Yeah, and then go get some breakfast
Where's your room?
in the hotel.
This continues until, at long last, the reality of the world takes over, and John has to face the music in his final conclusion of the episode. This final section is the shortest part of the episode, but it's also the most important. We've been laughing along with John throughout New York and abroad, but now he hits us with his pearl of wisdom that recontextualizes much of what we saw. At the end, John learns the real lesson of the episode, which isn't actually the answer to his how-to conundrum that was set up at the beginning, but a greater insight that was only learned through his experience, finally giving meaning to the whole pursuit. So, instead of learning how to have shallow conversations in the small talk episode, John makes a new friend by finally having a deep conversation. And that's the structure of How To with John Wilson. 4 sections that introduce a topic objectively, explore it subjectively, give us a big set piece to illustrate what happens when the rubber meets the road, and finally, a conclusion based on the new findings. As you might be noticing already, the journey we just carved out here doesn't exactly adhere to the classic 3-act structure that we film YouTubers tend to value so much. I mean, there's obviously a structure to the show. Kinda looks like 3-act structure, if you squint a little. Doesn't it? It sure doesn't feel like it's 3-act structure. John never really faces a central conflict that makes him take action, does he? Not in any traditional way. You could say that maybe the whole conflict of the episode is his quest for answers, but then it feels like Act 1 is limited to the cold open, which is kinda weird. You could say he makes his big act break choice when he tests his findings in the set piece section, but that really feels like Act 3, doesn't it? So, no hero's journey here, and although some of these episodes could resemble a disillusionment arc of sorts, John's inciting incident, if we want to call it that, would probably be when John starts to prepare for the travel section of the episode. And that comes not too long before the big event, which we would probably label as our 3rd act, but which comes about halfway through the episode. I mean, it still works. The narrative tracks. And though there's no Joseph Campbellian central conflict to these stories, there's a definite journey and a definite character arc in every episode. So now, as a story structure YouTube channel, where does this leave me? Okay, so I might be slightly biased toward How To with John Wilson. And it probably has something to do with the fact that I've known John Wilson since 3rd grade. And up through high school, the two of us and our group of friends pretty much did everything together. And I'm not trying to be like, hey, look at me, I know this guy in HBO.
Oh, my famous old friend. I tell a lot of people that I know you all the time.
It would just be pretty weird if I did this whole video and never mentioned that. It'd be like, oh yeah, by the way, I know him. Like, what's that about? Anyway, our high school friends, which also included How To 2nd Unit camera operator Chris Maggio, whose viral photos you may recognize from r/hmmm, spent much of our teen years making just a big bunch of crappy little movies together.
Where am I?
Over here.
What?
School assignments, 24-hour movie contests, and, we attempted a feature film. We finished it, it was just bad. So I don't want to get your hopes up. I'm not about to give you all the gory little details of John's personal life. I don't want to be the one guy who determines how he gets perceived by the world, no matter how innocuous the details are. It's bad enough I'm exploiting his fame for YouTube views in the first place. Because of this personal connection, I can verify a lot of what John presents to us isn't just fabricated for entertainment value. I remember his old cat that he briefly mentions in one episode. I remember him telling me about his idea to write everything he does down in a notebook. I remember him collecting Matrix action figures, and I could have sworn he went skiing at some point in high school, but perhaps that's just the Mandela effect misleading me. Over our many years working together, I was always becoming more and more focused on the structure of things. Of course, no surprises there. I didn't feel secure in our vision until we hammered out all the details in a script before we even turned the camera on.
It's the movie. We don't have an ending yet.
John, on the other hand, was very much the opposite. John liked to feel the spontaneity on the set.
I say we go out and improvise the ending. I think what always happens when we do film stuff is we think of stuff while we're filming, we get inspired.
And started opting to do more projects involving interviews and the use of non-actors. This difference was never really something we argued over. I think we both gave each other enough leeway to have it both ways, and we often compromised. But I suppose it's that basic disagreement that caused us to go into different creative paths. So after trying to reverse engineer his show's unique story pacing, as well as all of his shorts that inspired the TV show, it got me wondering what kind of structure John was actually using. Although we haven't really discussed the craft of filmmaking in quite some time now, I never knew John to be an avid consumer of Asian cinema, but the narrative style he seems to be borrowing most heavily from is the Japanese story structure of Kishoutenketsu, or Kishoutenketsu, I think. I really tried very hard to pronounce that correctly. If you're an anime or manga fan, you might already be familiar with this structure and not even know it. And if any of you are watching from China, Korea, or Japan, you've probably internalized this structure through cultural osmosis. But thanks for watching anyway! Kishoutenketsu is a story structure in 4 acts of varying length that conveys a narrative without the necessity of a central conflict. To be clear, there can be conflict in Kishoutenketsu, but it's not the whole point of the story like it is in the Western model. There appears to be more of an emphasis on theme or an exploration of ideas, rather than the strict ticking clock story we often see on the other side of the world. It's a concept that can feel a bit foreign to us people in the West, since we've been told by all of our writing teachers that conflict is the lifeblood of a story. To eschew all of that plot for an exercise in philosophy can seem like wasted screen time. But it's a story structure that has been quite prevalent in much of Asia for over 1,000 years. Due to the nature of this channel, I've been hyper aware of the story beats of everything that I watch.
Silly rabbit, tricks are for kids.
But while starting this video, I only had the vaguest understanding of the pace of Kishoutenketsu's story structure. So basically I sat down and watched a whole lot of Japanese cinema, taking notes and hoping that the formula for this 4-part storyline would present itself. Even though I had seen some of these films before, I found a lot of what I learned about conflict and moving a story forward seemed to not apply in many of them. And I guess I just never noticed that before. Some 90-minute films felt more like 3-hour epics, because my brain that grew up on the hero's journey kept expecting a clear break into Act 2 that was never really intended to happen. And then other movie plots just seemed to rush by because of how much story was crammed into the second act. It was different for sure, but in a refreshing way. Basically, if you're one of those naysayers who doesn't like anime, maybe give it a shot, because it could be the story structure you're not used to. You know, or the other stuff. Detailed information about Kishoutenketsu is pretty much non-existent in English. You go on YouTube and you see a bunch of bewildered Westerners trying their best to reference the same 3 English language papers that have been written about it. Even fan favorites like K.M. Wineland neglect this story structure when plotting out anime films, trying to force it into the nice, neat little 3-act structure that we have in the West, occasionally making notes to justify how it doesn't quite work, and labeling them as exceptions to the rule rather than accepting a new set of rules. Japanese YouTube is far different when it comes to researching Kishoutenketsu. There's a lot more out there, and all of these people have a lot more details than the others I saw, and they look a lot more confident. But of course there's the inevitable language barrier, and YouTube's auto-generated translation didn't help very much. Fans of my other channel, Shake the Box, know that I've been studying Japanese for years now.
Desolando. Deathland! I think I figured that out.
Talking with Japanese YouTubers yielded some results. Scraping together the minimal vocabulary I knew, I was able to get a few questions answered. Anyway, please take this next section with a nice big pinch of salt. But from all I can gather, Kishoutenketsu goes a little something like this. Kishoutenketsu's 4 acts are introduction, development, climax, and conclusion. Funny enough, we see these 4 acts in short form all the time in the West, in our sketch comedy. A setting is established, we explore a lot of funny jokes, the mayhem comes to a head in a grand way, and then of course there's a punchline at the end. But let's get to know these individual beats a little bit better in greater context. Key is the story's introduction. In the first part of the story, we're introducing important background information about the main characters and the setting. This is the part in Porco Rosso when we're first introduced to Porco Rosso. Here in the West, we'd probably liken this to the first part of Act 1, before any sort of inciting incident has clued us into how the story is going to shake out. In John Show, the introduction beat introduces the how-to topic rather than any characters or setting per se, but so far this seems to track. Next we have Show, the development of the idea. In this section, we add more depth to what was established in the first part. The stakes may or may not change much here, but there are often multiple mini-plots and arcs throughout this act to keep things fresh as well as hint toward other major changes on the horizon. Essentially, this act is kind of the premise of the story. This is the part of Kiki's delivery service when Kiki starts a delivery service. In the 3-act model, it still feels like we're in Act 1. We've pretty much crossed over the inciting incident at this point, but with no major conflict to start up Act 2, we're gonna get nice and cozy in this little premise for a long while. In John's Show, the development beat is the development of the how-to topic. This is where we go beyond the mere question and actually explore it, how it affects him personally, and how it affects different facets of our daily lives. This is also the part where we might hint at the major set piece that will be coming along in the next act. Next we have 10, the climax. This is the most exciting part of the story. Sometimes referred to as the twist, this is where all that was established before gets interrupted by a huge event. Maybe we leave the protagonist for a bit. Maybe our protagonists find a brand new threat that they haven't considered. Maybe there's a time jump and all the characters are older, or very very often it can just be the final test of the theme. This story beat takes on a lot of responsibility, because if you're watching a slow-paced, meandering story, this is where all the plot stuff happens. This is the part in Godzilla when Godzilla shows up. In our 3-act model, this is a bit of a tough one to pin down a comparison to. It feels like an inciting incident, an Act 2 break, a midpoint, the entirety of Act 2, or the big Act 3 showdown. I mean, it's probably closest to Act 3, but being where it comes in the story and how it's set up, it just feels different. In How To, the climax beat is when we get that big trip that takes us somewhere else and twists up all those pre-established assumptions that John made before. Finally, we have Ketsu, the conclusion. After the big twist, this last part is traditionally a re-examination or rejection of the initial concept, but done in a specific way that leaves us to stew in the truths about life. The long, plodding story that we felt so comfortable in has now been reframed with the addition of the 10-act, and now it's time to see what this whole story has really been about. This is the part in Perfect Blue when the movie ends and you say, wait, what the just happened? This is the shortest of all the acts, and our best equivalent in the Western model is that last bit of Act 3. After the big bad has been defeated, after the lovers get reunited, after the tragic hero screws herself over one more time, this is the takeaway that our protagonist, and perhaps the audience, learns. Though it also bears some resemblance to the awareness a protagonist can find right before the big Act 3 break. The difference here is that in many stories of the Kishoutenketsu model, conflict isn't at the forefront, and thus once our protagonist has their epiphany, there's no conflict to apply it to, and so the story may just end there. In John's show, this is where we learn the meaning behind the whole pursuit, and how the set piece ties back into the story, leaving us more enlightened than we started. This is where the whole theme of the episode is stated. When John tries to find out how to make small talk, he realizes that this pursuit is really just a way for him to get better at burying his feelings, and that the real answer to his problem is embracing those emotions and sharing them with people, to acknowledge his own humanity and the humanity of others. And funny enough, these epiphanies that John reaches in his episode's conclusions, the actual themes of the show, these all seem to have roots in yet another Japanese custom, the philosophy of Wabi-Sabi. Now, if you're not familiar with Wabi-Sabi, the experts will tell you it can't be defined by its very nature. So instead of assuming I'm smarter than an expert, I'm going to do my best to try to nudge us both in the right direction of understanding it so we can at least talk about it. Wabi-Sabi is often generalized as the appreciation of the flaws in life. Nothing is permanent, nothing is finished, and nothing is perfect. It's the acceptance of truth and being in harmony with the world's transient nature. Sure, it could be a rustic room layout or a cracked cup repaired with gold, but to stop at the aesthetics would be a very shallow interpretation if that's all you know. You can go on Amazon and buy a pair of jeans with holes already manufactured into them, but a couch with cat scratches tells the story of a short period of time when a man and his beloved feline companion inhabited the same home. How To with John Wilson seems to live within this mindset. It's not only baked into the theme of each and every episode, but it's also front and center in the aesthetics of the show. And although a meandering stream in a garden doesn't quite have the same aesthetic as a garbage bag pile, the beautiful chaos of it all seems to echo it in some respect. And of all the places to set the show, it's New York City, a location that's often depicted as this shining metropolis in our films, but John sees it for what it really is, a congested swarm of humanity that perpetually smells like car exhaust and urine. But he's not saying that's a bad thing. He's not really assigning any judgment to it at all. It just is. It's truth. And for what it's worth, there's something viscerally appealing about that honesty. In every episode, John fails to do what he set out to do. He never becomes a small talk expert. He never makes the perfect risotto. Strictly speaking, as a how-to guy, he does a really bad job. But by the end of each episode, he proves to us that our needs for approval, security, consistency, or perfection are all misguided. We're all asking the wrong questions and looking in the wrong places for the answers. Isn't just wanting to be a small talk expert just an excuse to never have to open up to anyone? Isn't covering up your furniture in plastic just avoiding natural change at the expense of your own comfort? When John gives up at the end of each episode, he becomes a better, wiser person. While seeking knowledge, he instead gains wisdom. There's no victory at the end, but there's enlightenment. And that's something more life-changing than just a mere job well done. Often, at least in Western culture, we see giving into the forces of nature as a defeat. After all, if life gives you lemons, you make lemonade, and then you sell that lemonade for more than it's worth and become rich off of it. But perhaps to be happier, we should just try and appreciate the lemons for what they are and all their tart, unique flavor. Now, I'm not Japanese, and neither is John Wilson, and though I don't fully understand the entire depth of the Wabi-Sabi philosophy, there's still something comforting about letting go of anxiety for a moment and accepting the true way of things. Maybe it's something that's been missing from my life, from all of our lives. And although I have no formal study in this particular subject, as a person with a YouTube channel, I feel I can conclude that all we really needed to find inner peace was this brilliant auteur to come onto our TVs and put everything in perspective for us. Or, you know, maybe thousands of Japanese artists have already been doing stuff like that for literal centuries, and I just need to read something other than Reddit for 5 minutes. Sometimes when an old friend of yours becomes famous for something you've always wanted to do, you may start to lose some perspective on reality. You want him to succeed so much because you feel like part of you is also succeeding in some small way, and it becomes incredibly hard to have a truly objective opinion on your friend's work. Though you have a unique insight into this filmmaker's artistic development, all you can do is praise it without being at all critical about it. You start to think maybe this unique insight doesn't really make you the best person to analyze his show. And as much as you feel emotionally connected to his art, you can't help but notice how much he's flourished since you stopped collaborating with him. Instead of directly pursuing filmmaking like he did, you found other side interests and other career paths. Career paths that you realize would directly benefit from getting an interview with your now famous friend. But how many other old friends of his are now suddenly asking him for favors? Maybe you've just become a fair-weather friend, only interested in keeping in touch when he's successful. Why didn't you reach out to him earlier? Why didn't you make a point to visit him when traveling through New York? Maybe if you have something smart to say, some new way of looking at his work, it won't just look like you've wasted your life and are just clinging to the past. And if you can't convince your friend of that, maybe you can at least convince yourself. But then your old friend, who you were worried was too busy for you, messages you back almost immediately. And although his life is more hectic than ever with his second season of his show in production, he's able to do a text-based interview for your tiny independent YouTube channel. I assume there's no proper script for this show, but while constructing a narrative, are there certain kinds of story beats that you try to hit in every episode? The script we use for production is kind of just a wish list for different story beats we'd like to hit. Like for the scaffolding episode, I knew I wanted to somehow work in a metaphor about settling for stuff you don't like. That made me think about similar stuff in my life, like the infomercial job. I also knew I wanted to put in the fashionable urban umbrella scaffolding after noticing it everywhere. So sometimes the story beats reveal themselves after thinking about a subject for long enough. But most of the time, I just interview people who I think are naturally interesting and ask them how they feel about the subject matter and see where that takes me. Each episode of your show seems to circle around a common theme that's best summed up at the end of the final episode. How early on in the process did you decide on this theme? I like building stories that have a very basic motivation that can act as a dumpster for different themes. It's always a good sign when you come up with an episode title and people chuckle and immediately start telling you how they'd do it. I like complicated topics that have no real rational solution. Your character arc in each episode doesn't exactly adhere to the usual 3-act structure. Have you at all been inspired by the Japanese structure of Kishoutenketsu? That's interesting, I never thought of it that way. I never wanted it to feel like a 3 or 4-act structure. I just wanted everything to feel like a stream of consciousness. I think it's closer to the way our thought process actually works. You could start trying to replace a light bulb and then somehow start to think about a really bad breakup for no discernible reason. And suddenly that consumes all of your thoughts and you forget where you started. Were you at all influenced by the Japanese philosophy of Wabi-Sabi? I feel like the show is an exercise in Wabi-Sabi in a way. A lot of the best stuff in the show just happened to be the stuff that felt imperfect. You have this one beautiful, imperfect moment and you try to build scaffolding around it. Kind of the way with Wabi-Sabi, they'll fill the cracks in a piece of broken furniture with something that makes the object more beautiful somehow. Instead of dismissing the unexplainable, I like to lean into it. Everything is just so polished and over-edited these days. We need real dog shit, not fake dog shit. We kept having to tell the quality control people at HBO that we intended for certain things. Like, they have to flag every time you see the camera person's hand or something. They're not used to material like this. I feel like there are a lot of genres present in the work, and I have a hard time picking it apart and remembering where everything's from. I feel like I take a lot from Iranian cinema, because they make the most beautiful stuff with some of the strictest censorship. It forces them to tell stories in a more subversive way, and sometimes they literally have to smuggle their films out of the country in birthday cakes. At the end of the day, the story is always dictated by the rhythms of real life, and I try not to worry about the structure too much until the edit. Well, thanks for helping me out with this. I'm going to let you know when this goes live. I'm hoping for sometime in March. I'll check it out when it's up. In the end, John and I were able to get back a little of what we had all those years ago, and the guilt I had going into this faded away into a familiar, collaborative feeling you get when you make a new video with your high school friends. So after trying to write just like John Wilson, poring over every scene and every edit, I would find that I was in fact taking the exact opposite approach of the filmmaker's actual process. And just like with Wabi-Sabi, maybe something this free-flowing can't be reduced to a set of rules, no matter how many experts you talk to. At some point, we all overanalyze things. We search for any sign of structure in our lives and look for conclusive patterns. But often, they're not there to begin with. And when you just assume you know what someone else is thinking, you might end up missing out on what they have to say. Reconnecting with old friends, regardless of their success, can be intimidating sometimes, but its rewards often outweigh the initial risk. And maybe if we take a step back, we can see that accepting life's uncertainty is not an impediment to living, but is the very flavor of life itself. Because the world is full of countless stories that we would never even think to write. This is Storyograph. Thanks for watching this kind of weird meta episode. And a huge thank you to John Wilson for all the great insight on the whole writing process. Honestly, this episode would have just kind of been awkward if you weren't involved. If any of you haven't seen the show, I just gotta plug it one more time. Season 2 is coming out really soon, and it might even be out by now if you're watching this from the future. And if you really like the video, you can help support the channel by sending me a cup of burnt bean water, link in the description. As for the next video, I'm gonna try something different this time and not tell you what it's going to be, because I'm not sure it's going to work, and I don't want to be stuck fixing it for months if a better idea comes along. Ideally, I'd like to get more than 2 videos out a year. But if you're new to the channel and want to see what a more normaler episode looks like, check out my video on Mulholland Drive, another oddly structured TV show. Wait, did I just call Mulholland Drive a TV show? I think I might have already said too much. Again, if anyone has any good resources for Kishoutenketsu, please put them in the comments. I gotta know more about this. Like, if you could speak Japanese, that would help too, because there's a lot of stuff I found, I just can't read it because I did not study enough.